Mesdames, Messieurs, bonjour. Bienvenue pour cette leçon du professeur Ronald Hendel sur la Bible et la mémoire collective. Donc, M. Hendel m'a dit qu'il fait un grand effort pour parler en français. S'il est trop fatigué, peut-être il va faire un petit détour via l'anglais pour revenir ensuite sur le français. Mais de toute façon, vous avez aussi les PowerPoint qui vont vous aider. Donc, je vais très, très brièvement vous présenter Ronald Hendel, qui a fait ses études à Harvard. Déjà, c'est pas mal. Et ensuite, il a été très longtemps professeur à une très belle place qui est l'université de Berkeley, où il a donc enseigné la Bible hébraïque et des études juives jusqu'à 2021. You are retired now or you have? Il est plus ou moins, voilà, donc il a arrêté cette chaire-là, mais il est encore professeur à l'université de Berkeley. Il a écrit beaucoup de livres qui m'intéressent. Vous allez voir, c'est un peu des choses dont j'ai aussi un peu fait des recherches sur le cycle de Jacob, sur Genèse 1 à 11, sur le texte de Genèse 1 à 11, sur Abraham, Remembering Abraham, Culture, Memory and History in Hebrew Bible, sur le livre de la Genèse, une biographie de la Genèse, traduit en italien et coréen. Donc, si vous ne voulez pas en anglais, vous pouvez le lire en coréen. Et autrement, donc, il s'intéresse beaucoup aussi à la critique textuelle. Il est en effet l'éditeur général d'une nouvelle édition critique de la Hebrew Bible, la Bible hébraïque. I don't know how many volumes.
There's one,
just one still. Ah, donc il y a les proverbes déjà qui existent, lentement. Mais ça va lentement, mais c'est normal pour ce type de travail. Écoutez, voilà, je suis très content. Monsieur Hendel est actuellement en résidence scientifique à Cambridge, donc en Angleterre, donc ce qui explique qu'il a pu venir plus facilement que depuis Berkeley. C'est assez long si vous allez jusqu'à San Francisco. Donc nous sommes très heureux qu'il a pu faire cet arrêt ici à Paris. Il m'a dit aussi qu'à la fin de sa conférence, il est tout à fait d'accord de prendre quelques questions, mais des questions, pas des mini-conférences, donc des questions. Voilà. Très bien, je le remercie et je lui laisse la parole. Bienvenue au Collège de France.
Merci. Oh, this is too much fun. You all came out in the rain. Mesdames et messieurs, je commence. Je suis heureux d'être ici dans l'amphithéâtre Maurice Alvars. Il découvrit il a écrit le livre classique de mémoire collective. Mon point de départ, c'est une conférence d'un professeur d'hébreu au Collège de France, comme Thomas, tenue à la Sorbonne il y a 140 ans, en 1882. L'orateur était Ernest Renan. Whoops. There we go. L'orateur était Ernest Renan, célèbre bibliste, et son thème était « Qu'est-ce qu'une nation ?» Renan n'a pas abordé la conscience de soi de la nation Israël, mais il a jeté son filet plus largement. Il a fait valoir que l'essence d'une nation découlait en partie de ce que Maurice Alvars a appelé plus tard la mémoire collective. Merci, Monsieur Alvars. D'après Alvars, il s'agit de la manière dont une société, suivant les circonstances et suivant les temps, se représente de diverses manières le passé. Dans sa conférence, Renan a mis de côté les justifications habituelles du nationalisme, la théologie, la métaphysique et la race. Au contraire, que l'essence d'une nation découle de deux facteurs, les mémoires partagées et le cancement commun. Il ajoute que ces souvenirs reçus ne sont pas une histoire complète ou fiable du passé. Pour que l'héritage des mémoires nourrisse l'identité nationale, il faut que certaines choses soient oubliées. Il dit « L'essence d'une nation est que tous les individus aient beaucoup de choses en commun et aussi que tous aient oublié bien des choses. » Les mémoires collectives sont inévitablement des lacunes historiques et des omissions stratégiques pour qu'une nation consente à vivre ensemble. Ces omissions incluent souvent les origines différentes d'un peuple. Être français, par exemple, c'est avoir oublié ses origines anciennes. Il dit « Aucun citoyen français ne sait si les Burgondes, Alain, Taïfal, je ne sais pas qu'est-ce que Taïfal, ou Visigoth. L'omission, la déformation et la révision du passé sont des ingrédients nécessaires de la conscience nationale. Comme justement écrit Renan, l'oubli, et je dirais même l'erreur historique, sont un facteur essentiel de la création d'une nation. Maintenant, j'ai donc une question. Préférez-vous que je continue en français ou peut-être en anglais? Répondez, s'il vous plaît. Oui. J'ai peur que mon français est faible, mais mon anglais est meilleur. Mais j'ai essayé. Oh, good, thank you. Yes, here we go. Modern scholars have continued these concerns of Renan and Albrecht, developing them in important ways. Many scholars now view nations as imagined communities, as Benedict Anderson describes them, whose self-consciousness is conditioned both by what is remembered and what is forgotten. As Anderson writes, new configurations of national consciousness bring with them characteristic amnesias. Out of such oblivions in special historical circumstances spring narratives. So what I will talk about today is how the Hebrew Bible consists of these collective memories. The Hebrew Bible is, in a sense, an archive of collective memories of how ancient Israel imagined its past, and how these memories also generate or depend on characteristic amnesias. This idea of the necessity of forgetting aspects of the past in order to create a national self-consciousness. I will address the biblical memories of the Exodus and of the visit of the Queen of Sheba to King Solomon to show how they are shaped by the dynamics of cultural memory. Now, the type of inquiry that I am pursuing, oh, it's so much easier for me to speak in English. The type of inquiry that I'm pursuing, I have it all in French, but this is easier. The type of inquiry that I am pursuing is called, after Jan Assmann, mnemohistory. So this is the history of memory. Mnemohistory depends on objects, rituals, different kinds of discourses that, yes, enable us to explore how the memory, the portrait, the representation of the past was constructed. As Assmann writes, unlike history proper, mnemohistory is concerned not with the past as such, but only with the past as it is remembered. So it's different than the normal erudition of historical inquiry. in that we're looking at representations of the past and how they came into being rather than being focused on the past itself. But as we'll see, these two concerns overlap. Yes, mnemohistory addresses the way that a group shapes an identity by reconstructing its past. Okay, so we're not looking at the past as such, the past, wie es eigentlich gewesen, but how a society reconstructs its past. And this is what Maurice Halbwachs was doing. Yes. Now let me turn to my first example, and that is the Exodus. So there's Mr. Renan and Mr. Halbwachs. There we go. So this is the portrait of the Exodus that is remembered in the Hebrew Bible. This is a picture from a famous Haggadah. This is the liturgy that one reads during Passover, during Pâques. And it says here, we were slaves to Pharaoh in the land of Egypt. And God brought us out from there with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm. So this is the idea of the Exodus. The people, and let me just say, this is from the Sarajevo Haggadah. And if you look at the very top, there's a dog pouring wine for a rabbit, which is how we always celebrate our Passover dinner. See that on the top? Isn't that cute? So when one drinks 4 glasses of wine, this is part of the ritual. And at that point, you can see the dog and the rabbit quite precisely. Not really. This is the reconstruction of the past. This is the representation of the past that is portrayed in the Exodus narrative. Now, there's 2 problems with understanding the mnemohistory of the Exodus. First of all, there's a set of problems involved with forgetting the past. And secondly, there's the issues involved with the reconstruction or the reimagining of the past as it is done in the Exodus story. So let's look first at the past that historians and archaeologists reconstruct. Before the rise of ancient Israel, that region of the world, ancient Canaan we call it, was part of the Egyptian Empire for roughly 300 or 400 years. Okay, so here you have Egypt. Oh, I can use my pointer. Here you have Egypt here, and here's the land of Canaan, which was the northern colony of the Egyptian Empire. And the Egyptian Empire also extended to the south, to Nubia, which was modern-day Ethiopia, which is the southern colony. So this was an empire, okay? And Canaan was ruled by Pharaoh for several hundred years prior to the rise of Israel. In fact, the rise of ancient Israel overlapped with the decline of the Egyptian Empire. Interestingly, there is no clear recollection of the Egyptian Empire in the Hebrew Bible. This past has been forgotten. Okay? In its place, we have the story of the Exodus, where the Israelites are enslaved to Egypt, in Egypt, okay? And then God rescues them, with his plagues and his signs and wonders, and defeats Pharaoh and leads the people out in a series of miraculous events. Okay? And then Moses leads them, and they wander in the Sinai desert for 40 years, and then they enter the land of Israel. Now, archaeologists have shown us that early Israel was largely a rural frontier society. In other words, people had moved from the lowlands of Canaan up to the hill country of Israel, where virtually no one had been living before. Now, the surprising part here is that this also shows us that there was no violent conquest of the Canaanites. Okay? That the actual historical circumstance was a peaceful settlement of a previously unsettled region. But again, this has been forgotten. So the historical reality of the rise of ancient Israel as a kind of peaceful settlement of an uninhabited region, this whole region having been ruled by Egypt for several hundred years before, this is all completely forgotten. What takes its place? Well, as we've seen, what takes its place is this new idea of having been slaves to Egypt. Whoops. There we go. Now, in fact, in the historical record, and this is the crux of my argument about the Nemo history of the Exodus, the ideology of the Egyptian empire was such that the people that they were ruling in Canaan were regarded in the imperial ideology as slaves to Pharaoh. Okay, so this is an important link. Here is a picture of captured Canaanite cities by one of the pharaohs, one of the first pharaohs of the Egyptian empire, Thutmose III. And notice each of these signs here is the name of a different Canaanite city, and each Canaanite city name is surrounded by a picture of a bound Canaanite captive. Okay, so they all look the same. These are all bound Canaanite captives. The import of this representation is that all of the Canaanites in Canaan are bound, captive, essentially subjects to the Pharaoh, essentially, in a functional sense, slaves of Pharaoh. Okay, captured slaves of Pharaoh. So this is part of the royal ideology of the Egyptian empire, that the people in Canaan were slaves of Pharaoh. This is expressed in many ways during the Egyptian empire. This is a statue here. This is a Canaanite who's lying prone on the ground. His arms are tied, which again is the image of the captured of the bound captive person whom Pharaoh has conquered. And here above the prone Canaanite on the ground are two large feet. These are the feet of Pharaoh. So the Pharaoh, the Egyptian Pharaoh, is literally in this image standing on the Canaanites, trampling on the Canaanites, which shows his power, his authority, and his total subjugation of them. This ideology that Pharaoh is completely dominating the people of Canaan, that they are his captives, in a sense his slaves, is also found in verbal form in a wonderful collection of letters from local Canaanite kings to the Egyptian Pharaoh that we call the Amarna letters, in which this phrase, under the feet of Pharaoh, is a recurring motif. So one king of Canaan says, I am your slave. Here's the language of slavery. Okay? The dirt under the feet of the king, the dust under the feet of the king. And here he says, the next one, I am dust under the sandals of the king, my lord, etc., etc. The last one is a letter from Pharaoh saying Ammon, the high god of the Egyptian pantheon, has given the upper land and the lower land. This corresponds to Canaan and Nubia, the two colonies, where the sun rises and where the sun sets, under the feet of the king. So the king is trampling on the people of Canaan and Nubia, and they are his captive slaves. This is the ideology of the Egyptian empire. It's being adopted here by the kings of Canaan. We are your slaves. We are the dirt under your feet. This is put in practice in a lot of different ways. For example, some of the most fertile valleys of Canaan became royal property, and these valleys were worked as agricultural land by local Canaanites under forced labor. So the local kings would force their local Canaanites to do labor for the Pharaoh, but in the land of Canaan. Okay? So all of these themes of domination by Pharaoh, of subjection over the people of Canaan or the Hebrews, working for him in the fields, working for him on buildings, these are all things that are going on in the land of Canaan as well. And if the local Canaanites didn't want to do these things for Pharaoh, well, there were a number of large military garrisons in Canaan that the Egyptians had. So this was essentially a military occupation of Canaan during the Egyptian Empire. Okay? Somehow, this historical reality of the subjection of Canaan under the feet of Pharaoh was, in a sense, forgotten but also reconfigured to be a picture of the era before the rise of Israel as slavery to Egypt, in Egypt. Okay? And the miraculous defeat of Pharaoh is due to God sending his plagues and so forth, which enabled Israel to escape from Egypt's grasp, escape from the house of Egypt, and form themselves as an independent people. My point here is that at least part of this story is resonating with the memories of people having been subjected to the authority and to the power of Pharaoh, even if they had never left Canaan. Okay? Now let me add that there were, during the Egyptian Empire, many Canaanite slaves who were taken into Egypt. And we have records of a handful of them escaping from Egypt and going back to Canaan. But there's no evidence that supports a large-scale movement of Canaanite slaves from Egypt to Canaan. Okay? There might have been some, and they might have taken stories with them of subjection in Egypt. But what most of the people who were early Israelites would have experienced was having been slaves to Egypt in the land of Canaan. And then they were all of a sudden released from this bondage because the Egyptian empire collapsed. And the Egyptians left Canaan and went back to Egypt.
Just ask, est-ce que c'est clair ou est-ce que vous voulez un petit résumé en français?
Très clair. Quite clear. It's perfect.
Thank you.
I'm an English teacher.
2 minutes, I give a little short.
Sure. Have I convinced you? Thomas is very skeptical of this.
Non, comme on a annoncé la conférence en français, il y a peut-être des gens qui ont un peu de difficultés. Donc, ce qui a montré le professeur Hendel, c'est d'où vient en fait cette idée qu'on était esclave en Égypte. Et ce qu'on peut voir du côté historique, c'est en effet que l'Égypte contrôle Canaan au deuxième millénaire. Mais en fait, l'idée d'esclavage, c'est plutôt par rapport en fait aux Cananéens, aux rois cananéens qui eux-mêmes se considèrent comme les esclaves du pharaon. Et en fait, ce qui se passe au niveau de la mémoire, c'est que vous avez une sorte en fait de transformation d'un souvenir historique qui en effet concerne la situation en Canaan, qu'on transfère en fait sur l'Égypte même. Tout d'un coup, on est esclave en Égypte, alors que c'est plutôt l'Égypte qui dominait Canaan. Il y a évidemment quelques esclaves cananéens qui, dans des contextes militaires ou d'autres, ont été déportés en effet en Égypte, et certains ont même réussi à s'en échapper, mais c'est quelques personnes individuelles. Donc l'idée que tout un groupe en fait passe de l'Égypte pour se sauver du pharaon en Canaan, ça évidemment historiquement c'est pas le cas. Par contre c'est ça le fondement après du récit biblique. Maybe I'll come back.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you. C'est meilleur en français. Yes. So in a sense, the Israel in the book of Exodus, the Israelites are reconstructing their past, in a sense, and I'll return to this at the end, in a sense to make it a better story, and to make it a story that is authored by God. Okay? And so in looking at the Nemo history of this story, we're seeing how this social imagination, this religious imagination interacts with the actual historical circumstances and transforms them totally into a greater, a monumental history. Okay, something that's not a secular history, but a history that is ordained by God and that creates a chosen people with a miraculous origin. Let me add that in a modern sense, this is a post-colonial discourse. That this is a former colony of Egypt that's reimagining its past in a way that, reshapes the past of this empire and makes the empire more evil, more grievous. I mean, it was a harsh empire, but this is a post-colonial discourse from the point of view of the subjected peoples, and in which their destiny is at the center of the whole story. So I think this idea of post-colonial imagination is very powerfully articulated in the Exodus story. The next example, the second example that I want to give you, which complements some of the features of the first example, is the story of the King Solomon and the visit of the Queen of Sheba. This is from an Ethiopian manuscript in which the Queen of Sheba becomes a very important figure in Ethiopian cultural memory. She's the ancestress, she and Solomon are the parents of the founder of the Ethiopian royal dynasty. But it's a lovely picture of the memory of this event. Now, the same sorts of problems concern the Nemo history of the story of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. In historical terms, 10th century Jerusalem was not a very impressive city. Here is a reconstruction of it. You can see it's sort of small. There's very few monumental structures. It's plausible that it's probable that this was the capital of a small kingdom, or the small capital of a small kingdom, but not very distinguished in its time. However, and this is what archaeologists tell us. So this is not me, this is the people that Thomas digs with in the summer, getting his hands dirty in the soil of Israel. But this modest beginnings of ancient Israel, this modest beginnings of the kingdom of Solomon, is forgotten in the stories of Solomon's kingdom in the Book of Kings. Instead, it's portrayed as a golden age, and Solomon is depicted as the greatest, most powerful, and wisest of all kings. So it says in 1 Kings chapter 5, Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines as far as the boundary of Egypt. So in Israelite imagination, Solomon is an emperor, that Solomon rules over an empire. Okay? This again, the actual modest realities have been forgotten and replaced with this picture of the Israelite empire. So foreign kings brought him tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. This is what it says in Kings. And he had peace on all his borders all around. Judah and Israel dwelled securely, each person under their vine and under their fig tree, from Dan to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. So it was a golden age, an age of peace, prosperity, and an age of imperial power. It continues, King Solomon was greater than all the kings of the earth in wealth and wisdom. They would each bring their tribute, vessels of silver and gold, robes, weapons, and here I want to emphasize spices, it says, in the amount due annually. The king made silver in Jerusalem as abundant as stones. So this is a golden age, but really it's a silver age because the silver is so abundant it's like stones. But if you look, you don't see any silver. It's just dirt and little buildings that are kind of hovels, and there's one or two monumental structures. Yes, one archaeologist, Ami Mazar, describes Jerusalem at the time of Solomon as a small town with a mighty citadel, which administered a state in an early age of evolution, far from the rich and widely expanding state portrayed in the biblical narrative. So again, this is what the archaeologists tell us about the historical reality. The crescendo in the biblical depiction of Solomon as the great king and the ruler of this golden age, the crescendo is the visit of the Queen of Sheba. She comes to discover for herself whether Solomon is as wealthy and as wise as he is reputed to be. She plies him with difficult questions. In the text, they're called riddles, and he's able to answer every single one. In a sense, she is testing the veracity, she is trusting the reliability of the biblical depiction of Solomon. Okay, she's like a third person, an outsider coming in to see if the biblical depiction of this golden age is correct, and she finds out that it is. She says, she finally proclaims, "The report that I heard in my land about your doings and your wisdom is true. I did not believe the words until I came and my eyes saw, and behold, they did not tell me the half of it. You exceed in wisdom and bounty beyond the report that I heard." So this is a very interesting strategic literary turn that role that she's playing. She's the one who's testing his wisdom to see if he is as wise as he is. And she also sees how wealthy he is. And his wealth and his wisdom far supersede what she has heard before. So she's what we call a fact checker. She's checking the facts, and she finds that the facts are even more amazing than she had anticipated, than she had heard. Having tested his wisdom, having seen his wealth, the Queen of Sheba gives Solomon a massive amount of gifts, including gold, incense, and precious stones. And it's the incense that's the key here, because the Queen of Sheba, the land of Sheba, was very wealthy because of the incense trade. It's in the biblical picture. Her gift is legendary. It says, "Never again did such an abundance of incense come as the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon." So no one ever gave such a gift of incense, of such a massive amount, before or since. Okay? So the story ends with Solomon also giving gifts to the Queen of Sheba. This is a way of each of them acknowledges the other as a great king by exchanging gifts. So they're both wise and wealthy royalty, the king of Israel and the Queen of Sheba. And then she goes back home. Interestingly, there's a certain erotic backdrop of the story. Yes, it says that she tells, there's a certain sexual tension in the story. She says, she tells him all that was in her heart, and he gave her all that she desired, whatever she asked. So there's a language of desire, a language of intimacy in a sense. But they do not consummate that in the story. They don't have sex. Okay. Oh, and let me add, the backdrop of the Arabian incense, this perfume also has an erotic association to it. And we see this very strongly in the Song of Songs, for example, where the smell of incense is always around the loving couple. So they don't have a sexual relationship in the story, but in all of the later retellings of the Queen of Sheba story, as in the Ethiopian tradition, they do have sex and have children, and the lost Ark of the Covenant is involved with this, and it makes marvelous stories when the two finally do get together. Now, how do we relate this representation of the golden age of Solomon with the reality on the ground of this poor Jerusalem in the 10th century? This hinges on the incense trade. It turns out that the incense trade was a very big economic aspect of commerce in antiquity. And it became a big thing in the 8th and 7th century BC, a couple of hundred years after the time of Solomon. The incense trade in antiquity was like the oil business today. Okay? It was a source of immense wealth. This incense trade started in Saudi Arabia and Yemen. The kingdom of Sheba, which arose as a kingship in the 8th century BC, became the controller of the incense trade. So the caravans would come from the bottom part of the Arabian Peninsula, and it would branch off in a couple directions. One of those branches went through ancient Judah, ancient Israel. Beersheba in the Negev seems to have been a major stopping point in the incense caravans, and then they would go to the port of Gaza, where they would then ship them all over the Mediterranean. So this is an example. This is an incense altar, a limestone incense altar that incense was burnt on, and the smoke would go up, and from Beersheba in the 8th century. And there's an interesting picture of a camel inscribed on this incense altar, which was the means of transportation of the incense trade. Now, one of the very interesting clues about the Nemo history of the story of the Queen of Sheba, Sheba, as I said, was a kingship beginning in the 8th and 7th century BC, became in charge, it controlled the incense trade, but all of the rulers of Sheba were men. And we have lots of texts from ancient Sheba that's in ancient Sabaean language. They're all men. But there were several queens of North Arabian tribes who were also involved in the incense trade. There are 7 different queens of North Arabian tribes that we know about in the 8th and 7th century. They're mentioned in Assyrian annals. This is a picture, I think, of one of them, the Queen Samsi, Queen of the Arabs, she is called. And in her raised hand, she has some beautiful bracelets. In her hand that's below is a container of incense, of frankincense. Okay, so this is showing that she is this figure associated with the incense, and then there's the camels behind her. The scholars have observed and suggested that the fact that there were these queens in North Arabia associated with the incense trade has some connection with the story of the Queen of Sheba. But I think we can say even more than that there's a connection, that there's a thematic connection with what these queens of Sheba are doing. This is from the annals of an Assyrian king who conquers Samsi, queen of the Arabs. It says, I vanquished 9,400 of her men. There's people, camels, and also 5,000 sacks of all sorts of aromatics that I took from her. She ran away, but then she's so afraid of my power that she came to Assyria and gave me more tribute. After Tiglath-Pileser's defeat of Samsi, other Arab polities also came to Assyria and offered tribute to the king, including, of course, all sorts of aromatics. Now, I suggest that in the Nemo history of the Queen of Sheba story, what we have here is a projection backward in time of these realities of the 8th and 7th century. In the reality, the the Assyrian king, who's the head of the Assyrian Empire, which ruled over Judah at the time, is the recipient of all of this tribute by Arab queens and by other kings associated with the incense trade. This is projected backward to Solomon, in a sense, I would say, as another kind of post-colonial or anti-colonial gesture. In a sense, it's a way of mimicking the realities of the Assyrian Empire, but saying our empire was so much better. We had a wise and a wealthy king, and the Queen of Sheba brought him even more incense than what the Assyrian kings are getting from the current queens of Arabia. In this sense, we see a number of transpositions. We see the transfer of locale from queens of North Arabia to the richest of the incense kingdoms, which is Sheba. We see a transfer of time from the 8th and 7th century incense trade and these tributes that are being given to the Assyrian king back to the 10th century, the era of Solomon. And we see the transfer of the Arabian queen's homage to the king from the Neo-Assyrian Empire to the Empire of Solomon. In other words, the greatness of Solomon becomes, in a sense, a critique and even a compensation, in Freudian terms, for being subjected to the Assyrian Empire at the time of the 8th and 7th centuries. Do you see what I mean? So this is a way of saying we're under the subjection of Assyria. This king is getting rich from tribute, from incense, from tribute from all of these wealthy Arab polities. But our king was even richer. Our king was even wiser. And our king ruled a peaceable empire. Okay? And the Queen of Sheba gave him incense such that no one has ever seen the quantity before. So it's a way of imagining a golden age, a utopia in the past that somehow overcomes the powerlessness of this imperial position of Judah and Israel in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. So this, I think, is this political meaning, this critique, this mimicry, this compensation is arguably a subtext of the story of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The biblical memory exalts Solomon as the exemplary ruler and his empire as a utopia. This memory compensates for the political subjection of Israel and Judah during the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The visit of the Queen of Sheba, in this sense, compensates for present subjection by conjuring a utopian imperial past, where the Arabian queen gives gifts to the Israel king in the context of wisdom, prosperity, and peace. Do you want to summarize?
Alors, le professeur Hendel a terminé sa démonstration de mémo-histoire sur l'Égypte en proposant que c'est en effet une sorte de discours post-colonial, à savoir que les opprimés, en fait, sont au centre du récit et qu'ils ont tendance, évidemment, à dépeindre l'oppresseur dans des termes encore plus dramatiques que peut-être la réalité historique peut nous le montrer. L'idée postcoloniale est aussi présente dans le deuxième exemple, Salomon et la reine de Saba. D'abord, on peut dire que en fait, Jérusalem, au Xe siècle avant l'ère chrétienne, ne correspond nullement à ce que la Bible raconte des fastes de Salomon. Donc, c'est en fait une sorte de construction d'un âge d'or dont Salomon est un peu le représentant. D'ailleurs, le nom Salomon même fait penser à paix. Et puis, c'est en effet, son règne est décrit comme un règne de paix et d'abondance. Et c'est en effet c'est l'exemple de la reine de Saba, c'est un peu l'apothéose de ce règne de Salomon, puisqu'elle vient d'un pays connu à partir, par contre, du 8e siècle, pour ses richesses liées en fait au commerce d'encens, où Saba est en effet joue un rôle très très important. Il a dit en passant aussi qu'il y a toute une connotation érotique dans les récits bibliques qui ne sont pas vraiment précisés. Par contre, ensuite, la tradition éthiopienne va le préciser et faire, en effet, on va raconter qu'il y a un fils de cette union qui va être à l'origine de la royauté éthiopienne, qui va aussi ramener l'arche en Éthiopie, mais ça, c'est une autre histoire. Ce qui est important dans la démonstration, c'est en fait, là, il y a aussi une sorte de transposition, puisqu'en effet, ce qu'on observe à l'époque assyrienne, 8e, 7e siècle avant l'ère chrétienne, c'est qu'il y a, en effet, un empire auquel, en fait, des reines d'Arabie donnent tribut. Donc, il vous a montré cette inscription. Et du coup, qu'est-ce que fait le récit biblique? Il adapte, en fait, cette situation pour la transposer sur Salomon. En fait, oui, il y a les Assyriens auxquels quelques reines arabes donnent des tributs, mais notre roi, notre premier grand roi, en effet, était beaucoup plus important que ce qui se passe maintenant. Donc c'est aussi une sorte de discours postcolonial, d'une certaine manière, en donnant de l'espoir aux Judéens à une époque où, en effet, ils étaient sous les coups des Assyriens, en disant, oui, les Assyriens peuvent bien faire ça, mais ils n'arrivent pas à égaliser notre grand roi Salomon.
Voilà. Merci. To conclude, I would like to emphasize that the representation of the past that we see in these case studies, how important it is in shaping ancient Israelite identity. And there's another interesting twist that I want to add, that remembering these things is commanded. Okay? It's commanded by Moses, it's commanded by God. And in an interesting strategic way in the narrative, the remembrance of these events is in some cases embedded in the events themselves. We see this particularly in the Exodus story, and here are some examples of where the future memory of these events is part of the narrative itself, even in some cases before the events have occurred. So there's an interesting play, a temporal play in these stories. So the obligations of memory are thematized in the Exodus story. In this first quote, it says, God is informing Moses that he has multiplied the plagues, the signs and wonders, so that you may recount in the ears of your children, afin que vous racontiez aux oreilles de vos enfants, and your children's children, how I dealt harshly with Egypt, with my signs that I set among them, that you may know that I am Yahweh. So here we see that the plagues are not even done yet. And Yahweh is saying to Moses, I've multiplied these plagues to make a great story, so that you will tell them to your children and your children's children how I toyed with the Egyptians, so that you may know that I am Yahweh. And the flip side of this last phrase, that you will know that I am Yahweh, this is a motif in the biblical text, and that you are my people. So in a sense, God is the director of the story. He's sending all of these plagues so that it makes a great story, so it makes a great spectacle, a monumental story, that you will recite to your children and your children's children, so that they will know that I am Yahweh, and that you are my people, and that you came from this story. Okay? So the future remembrance of these events is commanded or is intimated, is predicted within the events themselves. So Yahweh makes it a great story so that you will tell the story in the future. The point of these events, in a sense, is so that they will be recounted and remembered in the future. Slightly later, before crossing the Red Sea, so the Exodus hasn't actually fully occurred yet, Moses commands the Israelites, souviens-toi de ce jour où tu es sorti d'Égypte. Remember this day when you went out of Egypt from the house of slavery, how with a strong hand Yahweh brought you out from here. Remember this day. Well, the events of this day haven't even happened yet. And he's saying you must remember this day, remember these events. He continues saying that he gives additional instructions about the future commemoration of the Exodus, again, even before the Exodus has fully happened. He says, when your child asks you in the future, saying, what is this? You will say to him, with a strong hand, Yahweh brought us out of Egypt from the house of bondage. Okay? Lorsque votre enfant vous demande à l'avenir, so the future remembrance is built into the narrative itself. This becomes a refrain in the last part. Tu diras à ton enfant ce jour-là, on that day in the future, you will tell your child because of what Yahweh did for me when I went out of Egypt. So the future remembrance of the story is foregrounded in the story itself. Cultural memory, in a sense, is thematized and even commanded in the story. And the recounting of the story as cultural memory is, in fact, in some way, the motivating force of the events themselves. The events happen so that they will be recounted in the future within the people of Israel to show them who they are and who Yahweh is. Notice that the temporal distance between past and future collapses in this verbal network between the events and their remembrance in ritual and story. Je reviens en français. L'obligation de se souvenir de ce que Yahweh a fait pour moi liait les générations passées et futures. Elle met en avant la continuité du temps. Comme les souvenirs involontaires de Proust, causés par la Madeleine, les sensations de la commémoration rituelle, la Pâque, évoquent ce tissu conjonctif du passé et du présent. Comme l'indique le Haggadah de la Pâque, à chaque génération, on est obligé de se voir comme si on était sorti de l'Égypte. La continuité de la mémoire personnelle est attirée dans la mémoire collective, mêlant passé et présent dans un moment de transition. Cette connectivité, selon les mots de Proust, est due à ce qu'elle avait de commun dans un jour ancien et maintenant dans ce qu'elle avait d'extratemporel. Le pouvoir de la mémoire collective en ce sens, et de puiser dans le passé du groupe pour retrouver le quelque chose de partagé qui anime cette sensibilité extratemporelle. Au sein de Renan, elles font partie des expériences qui créent l'essence d'une nation ou d'une ethnie, qui, aidée par avoir oublié beaucoup de choses, s'imagine l'être de la nation. La mémoire collective est, comme écrit Alvars, un tableau de ressemblance reliant le passé et le présent qui permettent au groupe de se reconnaître toujours dans ces images successives. La conscience de soi d'une nation se construit sur ces ressemblances et les moments de reconnaissance qu'elles permettent. C'est un arrière-plan tacite du commandement de Moïse. Souviens-toi des jours d'autrefois, pensez au temps passé. Merci.